In the deserts of the Pacific coast, three nations fought a war over white gold that reshaped borders, economies, and global trade, yet few outside South America have ever heard of it. By the late 19th century, the arid landscapes of South America's Pacific coast concealed a tension that was rapidly escalating into outright conflict. Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, three nations with vastly different political trajectories, found themselves entangled in a struggle driven not just by territory, but by wealth buried beneath the desert sands. The stage for the War of the Pacific, 1879 to 1884, was set not in the grand halls of diplomacy alone, but in the harsh, mineral-rich deserts of Atacama and along the narrow, windswept coast of Antofagasta. Chile, emerging from internal consolidation and rapid modernization, had developed a relatively stable political system and a growing economy based on mining and trade. Its leaders viewed the mineral-rich northern territories as vital, both for national security and for economic expansion. A sense of national destiny, combined with military reforms and the acquisition of modern naval vessels, made Chile an assertive player in regional politics. For Chile, control over the nitrate-rich desert was more than a question of borders. It was an opportunity to secure a foothold in the global economy. Peru, in contrast, was a nation struggling to balance its traditions with the pressures of modernization. Though economically wealthier than its neighbors due to the exploitation of guano deposits on coastal islands, Peru's political institutions were often unstable, oscillating between civilian administrations and military guano. The accumulated excrement of seabirds, rich in nitrates and phosphates, had become Peru's white gold, fueling both domestic revenue and foreign trade. By the 1870s, however, the easily accessible guano deposits were dwindling, and the Peruvian government had turned its attention to nitrate-rich territories inland. This shift brought Peru into direct tension with its neighbors and exposed the fragility of alliances in the region. Bolivia, landlocked and geographically constrained, had long sought access to the Pacific coast to facilitate trade. The Atacama Desert, claimed by Bolivia but inhabited largely by foreign-owned mining enterprises, became the epicenter of dispute. Bolivia's economic dependence on mining taxes made the borderlands more than mere desert. They were essential to the country's survival. Politically, Bolivia was less centralized than Chile, with regional elites holding substantial autonomy, which complicated efforts to present a unified stance in international negotiations. But the heart of the conflict were the resources of the desert itself, guano and nitrate, substances that transformed the barren sands into instruments of global commerce. In an age when agriculture across Europe and North America increasingly relied on chemical fertilizers, these minerals became strategic commodities. Guano had already been mined extensively for decades, but the rise of synthetic fertilizers and the discovery of nitrate-rich saltpeter deposits made control over these territories even more critical. Nitratite, the key ingredient in fertilizers and explosives, could turn a remote desert into a prize of immense geopolitical significance. Nations that controlled these resources wielded power far beyond the Andes and the Pacific, influencing markets in London, New York, and Hamburg. The tension between Chile, Peru, and Bolivia crystallized in the border region of Antofagasta, a narrow strip of desert along the Pacific coast. Bolivia's claims to the territory collided with Chilean commercial interests and settler communities, many of whom were engaged in nitrate extraction. Disputes over taxation and land rights frequently erupted into diplomatic incidents, creating a volatile mix of economic grievances and national pride. Meanwhile, Peru, seeking to protect its nitrate revenues and maintain a strategic buffer against Chilean expansion, negotiated secret alliances that would later shape the course of the war. Yet the story of the War of the Pacific is not solely one of governments and armies. The desert itself was inhabited by a mosaic of social actors whose lives were transformed by the struggle over resources. Mining communities, often composed of laborers from across South America and even Europe, endured harsh working conditions, extreme temperatures, and a tenuous relationship with colonial-style companies. Indigenous populations, who had long navigated the desert landscape, were drawn into the conflict indirectly, their lands and labor co-opted by foreign powers and national governments alike. Foreign involvement was pronounced. British investors owned a significant portion of the nitrate operations, and American merchants and engineers supplied technology and capital. This international presence ensured that the desert's resources were enmeshed in a web of global economic interests. Thus, the War of the Pacific was rooted in far more than simple territorial ambition. It emerged from a confluence of economic necessity, political instability, and the global appetite for the desert's minerals. The Atacama and Antofagasta regions, seemingly inhospitable to life, had become arenas where national ambitions, corporate interests, and human endurance intersected. In these desolate expanses, the shadow of war loomed long before the first shot was fired, a war that would reshape borders, economies, and societies across the western edge of South America. In retrospect, the desert's sands were a silent witness to a drama that combined modern military technology with ancient struggles over land and survival. The narrative of guano and nitrate, of foreign financiers and local laborers, and of states driven by both fear and greed, set the stage for a conflict that would be remembered far less than its significance deserved. Yet, it was in this unforgiving landscape that the seeds of the War of the Pacific were sown, and in its shadows, the future of an entire region would be irrevocably altered. As the 1870s drew to a close, the simmering tensions in the Atacama Desert began to crystallize into an international crisis. While the desert itself seemed desolate and lifeless, it had become a chessboard of diplomacy, economic interests, and national pride. Early attempts to resolve disputes between Chile, Bolivia, and Peru were marked by a mix of miscommunication, conflicting ambitions, and the overpowering lure of mineral wealth, particularly the valuable nitrates that promised unprecedented profits for those who controlled them. The initial diplomatic efforts were grounded in a series of treaties and conventions, yet they failed to address the underlying tensions. Chile and Bolivia had long disputed the border along the coastal desert, a region that was formerly Bolivian territory but economically dominated by Chilean settlers and entrepreneurs. In 1874, both nations signed a boundary treaty meant to clarify sovereignty and economic rights. Under this agreement, Bolivia was to impose no new taxes on Chilean companies operating in its coastal provinces for a period of 25 years. In theory, this should have secured a stable environment for commerce and a peaceful coexistence. In practice, however, it only set the stage for a catastrophic miscalculation. Both sides interpreted the treaty through the lens of national interest, and neither trusted the other to honor the commitments fully. The role of foreign companies in the region added another layer of complexity. One of the most significant players was the Compañía de Salitres y Ferrocarril de Antofagasta CSFA, a Chilean-owned nitrate and railway company operating on Bolivian soil. The company represented not just commercial interests but a projection of Chilean influence into contested territory. Its operations provided jobs, infrastructure, and a measure of stability for local settlements. Yet they also became a lightning rod for Bolivian concerns about sovereignty. Bolivia's attempts to regulate and tax the CSFA were seen by Chile as a breach of the 1874 treaty, while Bolivia viewed Chile's protection of the company as an infringement on its sovereign rights. Foreign investment, far from being a stabilizing force, acted as a catalyst for conflict. British financiers, who had stakes in nitrate production, closely watched these developments, often lobbying in Europe to protect their investments, while American traders began positioning themselves to benefit from that anticipated instability. The tension escalated dramatically in 1878, when Bolivia imposed a new tax on the CS. Ignoring the treaty clause that exempted Chilean companies from such levies, Chilean authorities protested, demanding immediate repeal and threatening intervention. Bolivia, under pressure from domestic political factions who saw foreign dominance of the desert as a threat to national sovereignty, refused to back down. Diplomatic channels, strained and fragile, proved inadequate. Envoys exchanged formal letters of protest, but each message contained subtle insinuations and implicit threats that hardened positions rather than soften them. Watching these developments, sought to position itself as both mediator and defender of its own interests. As the primary owner of nitrate-rich lands, Peru was acutely aware of the strategic and economic stakes. It entered into secret defensive alliances with Bolivia, promising military support in case Chile used force. While publicly advocating for negotiation and adherence to treaties, Peru was quietly preparing for the possibility of war. The combination of secret pacts and ambiguous public diplomacy created a web of misunderstanding that ensured any small incident could trigger a broader conflict. Indeed, the spark came in the form of what might have seemed a minor administrative action. Chilean citizens in Antofagasta resisted the Bolivian tax, and Chile dispatched a small naval contingent to protect its nationals and commercial interests. Bolivia interpreted the move as an act of aggression, while Chile framed it as the protection of legal rights under international law. The incident escalated into a full diplomatic crisis, drawing attention not only from neighboring states but also from European powers who had investments and strategic interests in the Pacific coast. Newspapers in London, Hamburg, and New York reported on the Chilean intrusion, highlighting the potential for a wider conflict. What stands out in this episode is the interplay between diplomacy and miscalculation. Treaties that were meant to prevent war became instruments of misunderstanding because of ambiguous language, differing interpretations, and competing domestic pressures. The involvement of foreign corporations magnified every misstep. Chilean business interests were not merely passive observers. They actively lobbied their government to assert control over Bolivian territory, viewing diplomatic negotiation as too slow and unreliable. Bolivian officials, meanwhile, feared appearing weak in the eyes of their citizens if they failed to defend their sovereignty, even if practical considerations dictated restraint. Peru's secret commitments, designed as a deterrent, only added to the perception of an inevitable escalation. By early 18, the situation had transformed from a localized border dispute into a full-blown international crisis. The failure of diplomacy was not due to the absence of effort, but rather to the conflicting imperatives of national pride, economic interest, and external influence. Each party believed it was acting rationally to protect its own sovereignty or economic advantage. Yet these actions collectively produced the opposite result: the breakdown of peaceful negotiation. What might have been resolved through careful arbitration instead accelerated toward open conflict. In retrospect, the War of the Pacific can be traced to these early failures of diplomacy and the combination of poorly drafted treaties, aggressive commercial interests, secret alliances, and rigid national pride created a combustible environment. The minor disputes over taxation and border demarcation, seemingly technical and solvable, served as the tinder that ignited a war with consequences far beyond the Atacama Desert. By the time Chilean forces moved decisively into Antofagasta in February 1879, the stage was set, a war fueled as much by economic ambition and misjudged diplomacy as by traditional notions of honor and territorial conquest. The desert that had once been a silent witness to trade and settlement was now poised to become a theater of military innovation, naval duels, and brutal desert campaigns. Diplomacy had failed, miscalculations had multiplied, and the War of the Pacific was no longer a distant threat, was inevitable. The War of the Pacific was not fought solely on the deserts of the Atacama. It also raged across the Pacific coast, where the shimmering blue waters hid iron leviathans and the fate of nations. By the late 19th century, naval technology had entered an era of steel and steam, transforming traditional maritime warfare. For Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, control of the sea became paramount. Whoever dominated the Pacific would dictate the movement of troops, supplies, and commerce. The war's outcome would hinge not only on desert campaigns but on a maritime struggle that tested the limits of human courage and engineering. Chile entered the conflict with a modernizing navy, strategically designed to assert dominance over its northern neighbors. Its fleet included ironclads such as the Blanco Encalada and Almirante Cochrane, armored ships capable of withstanding enemy fire that would have shattered wooden hulls of previous generations. These vessels, powered by steam engines and bristling with heavy artillery, represented a dramatic shift from centuries of naval tradition. Complementing the ironclads were smaller, faster ships intended for reconnaissance, blockade enforcement, and coastal raids. Chile's naval command recognized that controlling the sea lanes was essential to supply its advancing army and to prevent Peru from reinforcing coastal garrisons. Peru, meanwhile, relied on both heritage and innovation. Its navy included the armored frigate Huáscar, a monitor-style vessel equipped with revolving turrets, and the Independencia, a fast iron-hulled warship. The Huáscar, in particular, would become legendary not merely as a tool of war, but as a symbol of national pride and ingenuity. Despite being outnumbered, the Peruvian Navy used mobility, tactical daring, and intimate knowledge of coastal waters to challenge Chile's superiority. Bolivia, constrained by its landlocked status, contributed only minimally to naval operations, relying largely on riverine craft and coordination with Peru. Its role was peripheral, yet politically significant. Its alliance with Peru bound it to the naval dimension of the war. Early naval strategy revolved around blockade and attrition. Chile imposed a blockade on key Peruvian ports, particularly the vital port of Callao, seeking to strangle Peru's supply lines and limit its ability to project power. Peru, in turn, attempted swift raids and hit-and-run tactics, leveraging the speed and maneuverability of ships like the Huáscar to harass Chilean vessels and maintain morale at home. These initial maneuvers were more than mere military operations. They represented a contest of industrial capacity, strategic foresight, and psychological endurance. The ironclads themselves were new instruments of war, yet they demanded meticulous maintenance, careful coordination, and crews who could operate under the extreme pressures of combat at sea. The first major naval confrontation, the Battle of Iquique on May 21, 1879, demonstrated the deadly stakes of this ironclad era. The Chilean corvette Esmeralda, lightly armored and outgunned, faced the formidable Peruvian Huáscar. Despite its disadvantages, Chilean Captain Arturo Prat engaged the enemy, choosing honor over tactical retreat. The battle ended tragically for Chile, with the sinking of the Esmeralda and the death of Prat. Yet it ignited a fervent national spirit and became a rallying point for the Chilean war effort. For Peru, the victory of the Huáscar highlighted the effectiveness of mobile armored warships and cemented Admiral Miguel Grau's reputation as a masterful naval tactician. The psychological impact of the battle extended beyond military lines. Newspapers across South America recounted heroic deeds, elevating morale and shaping public perception of the war. The war's decisive naval engagement came later that year at the Battle of Angamos on October 8, 1879. Chilean forces, having learned from prior encounters, executed a coordinated operation to capture the The battle was a brutal clash of iron and steam, with both sides sustaining heavy damage and casualties. Admiral Grau of Peru was killed in action, his death marking the end of Peru's effective naval resistance. The capture of the Huáscar allowed Chile to secure maritime supremacy, enabling unimpeded troop movements along the northern coast and the eventual occupation of key Peruvian ports. The battle illustrated not only technological superiority but also strategic patience, logistical planning, and the harsh realities of 19th-century naval combat. Life aboard these iron leviathans was harsh and unforgiving. Sailors faced extreme heat in engine rooms, deafening noise from cannon fire, and the constant threat of sinking or boarding actions. Disease, malnutrition, and fatigue were as dangerous as enemy fire. Morale fluctuated with every skirmish, and the psychological toll of witnessing friends and comrades die in confined metal corridors was profound. Yet the war also forged bonds of loyalty, courage, and national identity. Letters and diaries from Chilean and Peruvian sailors describe moments of quiet reflection between engagements, the monotony of blockade duty juxtaposed against the adrenaline of battle, and the constant awareness that life and honor were inseparable at sea. In the end, control of the oceans proved decisive for Chile's overall campaign. Naval supremacy enabled the rapid deployment of troops along the coast, facilitated supply chains through treacherous desert terrain, and allowed the Chilean army to conduct operations deep into Peruvian territory without significant threat of interdiction. The War of the Pacific illustrated the transition from wooden ships to iron leviathans, from coastal raids to strategic blockades, and from localized skirmishes to campaigns that intertwined technology, strategy, and human endurance. The ironclads of Chile and Peru were more than machines. They were symbols of industrial power, national ambition, and the emerging modernity of South American warfare. They transformed the Pacific coast into a theater of high-stakes combat where courage, innovation, and miscalculation intertwined. As the war continued, the lessons learned at Iquique and Angamos would shape not only naval doctrine, but also the broader course of a conflict, whose shadow extended far beyond the desert sands. While the ironclads of Chile and Peru clashed along the Pacific, the war's outcome was equally determined by the struggle on land. The Atacama Desert, a seemingly barren expanse of sand, rock, and sun, became one of the most grueling theaters of the War of the Pacific. The region's extreme environment, scorching heat, relentless winds, and scarce water transformed ordinary military operations into feats of endurance and ingenuity. Infantry units, cavalry, and artillery were forced to adapt their traditional tactics to a terrain that was as much an enemy as the opposing army. Logistics presented the first and most relentless challenge. Troops marching across the desert faced blistering daytime temperatures, exceeding 40 degrees Celsius (104 Fahrenheit) and freezing nights. Sandstorms could reduce visibility to a few meters, while the rocky terrain tore at boots and equipment. Water, the most precious commodity, had to be transported over long distances in limited quantities. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers, vulnerable to sabotage and disruption. Armies had to coordinate carefully, ensuring that food, ammunition, and medical supplies reached forward positions without delay. In many ways, the war in the desert became a contest of endurance and resource management as much as tactical skill. Infantry tactics had to be modified to survive and fight in these conditions. Marches were planned to avoid the heat of midday, with units often moving at night or early morning. Soldiers carried reduced loads to minimize fatigue, relying on mobile supply depots and pack animals for heavier equipment. Trenches and improvised fortifications were dug into the sandy soil to provide cover from artillery fire and the sun's relentless glare. In open terrain, skirmish lines were spread wider than usual to reduce casualties from enemy rifle and cannon fire. Artillery positions were selected for both strategic advantage and practical protection against the shifting desert sands, which could undermine the stability of cannons and supply wagons. Cavalry units, though smaller than in European conflicts, played a critical role. Mounted troops conducted reconnaissance, carried messages, and executed flanking maneuvers to harass enemy positions. In some engagements, cavalry charges across flat desert expanses could overwhelm poorly prepared infantry, but the extreme heat often limited the endurance of both horses and riders. Units had to ration water carefully and manage the timing of movements to avoid losing mobility when it was most needed. The use of traditional charges combined with modern firearms and artillery reflected a hybrid approach. Commanders adapted old tactics to new realities, blending the lessons of Napoleonic warfare with the demands of a harsh and unfamiliar environment. The first major land engagement, the Battle of Tarapacá in November 1879, illustrated both the challenges and ingenuity of desert warfare. Chilean forces, advancing to secure nitrate-rich regions, faced a determined Peruvian army entrenched in a position near the oasis town of Tarapacá. The desert terrain limited maneuverability, forcing both sides into close engagements where discipline, marksmanship, and knowledge of the environment were decisive. Peruvian troops, though outnumbered, used the rugged terrain and knowledge of local water sources to hold key positions. The Chileans eventually prevailed, but at significant cost, highlighting that control of the desert required not only firepower but endurance, strategy, and careful logistical planning. The Battle of Tacna, in May 1880, further demonstrated the integration of modern military tactics in the desert. Chilean forces, now seasoned from earlier campaigns, coordinated infantry, artillery, and cavalry to break the Peruvian-Bolivian defensive line. Trenches and fortifications were assaulted under the scorching sun, while Chilean artillery pounded enemy positions from a distance. Cavalry flanked the defenders, cutting off retreat and supply. The engagement showed how traditional European tactics line formations, frontal assaults, and combined arms operations could be adapted to extreme environmental conditions. The victory at Tacna opened the way for Chilean forces to advance further into southern Peru, but it also exacted a heavy toll in casualties, reflecting the brutal nature of desert combat. Finally, the Battle of Arica in June 1880 exemplified the integration of infantry, artillery, and limited naval support. Chilean forces faced Peruvian defenders entrenched on the cliffs overlooking the port. Assaulting troops had to advance across exposed ground under intense cannon and rifle fire, a task made more arduous by heat, loose sand, and limited water. The use of scaling ladders, concentrated artillery barrages, and coordinated infantry movements demonstrated both innovation and desperation. The fall of Arica, following a ferocious struggle, underscored the human cost of desert warfare. Soldiers endured dehydration, exhaustion, and extreme temperatures, yet continued to press the attack in the pursuit of strategic objectives. The Desert Campaign revealed that human endurance was as crucial as military technology. Troops, morale, the ability to adapt tactics to terrain, and the careful management of resources often decided outcomes more than numbers alone. Commanders learned to integrate mobility, fortifications, and artillery in ways that maximized effectiveness in an environment hostile to both men and machines. Infantry units, moving on foot through sand and rock, became instruments of persistence and resilience, carrying the weight of national ambitions across inhospitable landscapes. By the end of these campaigns, the Atacama Desert had transformed from a quiet, mineral-rich expanse into a crucible of military innovation and human endurance. Chile's eventual success in the desert reflected not only superior planning and firepower, but also a mastery of logistics and adaptation to one of the harshest environments on the planet. The desert had tested every soldier, every tactic, and every piece of equipment, leaving an indelible mark on the history of the War of the Pacific. The War of the Pacific was, at its core, a battle over wealth buried in the sands of the Atacama Desert. While national pride and territorial ambitions drove the participating states, the true engine of conflict was economic: the region's guano and nitrate deposits. These substances, dubbed white gold for their transformative effect on agriculture and industry, connected the arid Pacific coast of South America to the farthest corners of the globe. In many ways, the war was a confrontation between nations vying not just for land, but for control of resources whose value extended far beyond the Andes. Guano, accumulated over centuries on the rocky islands off the Peruvian coast, had long been recognized as a potent fertilizer. By the mid-19th century, European and North American agriculture had become heavily dependent on imported guano to sustain soil fertility and meet the growing demand for food. Peru, blessed with these islands, had enjoyed a period of extraordinary wealth. The revenue generated by guano exports financed infrastructure, military procurement, and government operations. However, by the 1870s, the most accessible deposits were diminishing, and attention shifted to nitrate-rich territories inland, particularly the mineral-rich deserts of Bolivia and northern Chile. Nitratite, an essential ingredient for both fertilizers and explosives, had become a strategic resource. Control of these deposits was not merely a national concern. It was an economic lever, capable of influencing markets from London to New York. The competition for nitrate and guano deposits drove both expansionist policies and military strategy. Chilean authorities recognized that securing the Atacama Desert and the port city of Antofagasta would provide a critical supply of nitrates to fund the national economy and sustain global trade. For Peru and Bolivia, defending these territories was equally vital, both economically and symbolically. The desert's minerals had become intertwined with sovereignty itself, and this linkage made compromise difficult. Treaties and diplomatic negotiations, while well-intentioned, were secondary to the perceived imperatives of resource control. The war, in effect, was a struggle to dominate a commodity that had transformed a remote desert into a focal point of global economic interest. The impact on international trade was profound. Nitrates and guano were exported across the Atlantic and the Pacific, fertilizing crops in Europe and the United States and fueling industrial growth. London's financial markets were particularly attentive, British banks and investors had substantial holdings in nitrate enterprises, and disruptions in production threatened not only local economies but also global supply chains. In the United States, speculation in nitrate stocks and investment in mining operations linked American fortunes to the outcome of military campaigns thousands of miles away. Merchants, speculators, and industrialists monitored every skirmish, recognizing that a Chilean victory or Peruvian defense could send prices soaring or plummeting. In this sense, the War of the Pacific was not an isolated regional conflict, but a critical node in the 19th century global economy. Foreign companies were central actors in this economic theater. De Compañía de Salitres y Ferrocarril de Antofagasta CSFA, a Chilean enterprise operating on Bolivian soil, exemplified the intersection of private enterprise and national ambition. Its railway infrastructure and mining operations facilitated the extraction and transport of nitrates to ports for export, effectively linking the desert to global markets. British investors, who financed much of the mining infrastructure, had a vested interest in the continuation of operations under stable governance. American companies provided technology, equipment, and logistical support, seeking to capitalize on both production and market volatility. The desert became a nexus where state and private interests merged, with fortunes and national strategies intertwined in complex, often combustible ways. Speculation amplified the stakes. Financial markets reacted not only to the physical availability of nitrate and guano, but also to the perceived security of supply routes. Rumors of military engagements or blockades could trigger dramatic fluctuations in prices, while successful campaigns promised profits beyond the immediate value of extracted minerals. In London, newspapers and brokers followed reports from Tarapacá and Arica with intense scrutiny, analyzing which side would prevail and how it would affect contracts, dividends, and futures. In New York, investors similarly tracked developments, understanding that the war's outcome could shift the balance of commodity markets and influence global agricultural production. In this way, the conflict linked the fate of desert towns to the fortunes of financiers thousands of miles away. Yet while international markets reacted to the ebb and flow of battle, local populations bore the tangible consequences of economic imperatives. Mining communities endured harsh working conditions, their labor vital to both national economies and global commerce. Soldiers fought not only for territorial control, but also to secure the economic lifelines that sustained their nations. Every skirmish, every captured port, and every blockade had ripple effects on production, trade, and the livelihoods of workers, illustrating the human dimension of what might otherwise appear as an abstract struggle over resources. The War of the Pacific, therefore, was as much a conflict over economics as it was over territory. Guano and nitrate transformed the Atacama Desert from an inhospitable wasteland into a strategic battlefield, connecting local skirmishes to global financial currents. The engagement of foreign companies and international speculators intensified the stakes, ensuring that the consequences of victory or defeat would reverberate far beyond South America. By controlling these resources, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia were not merely asserting sovereignty, they were positioning themselves within a global network of trade, finance, and industrial growth, demonstrating that the modern battlefield extended beyond cannons and rifles into the markets of London and New York. In retrospect, the war underscores how economic imperatives can drive conflict, often in ways more decisive than political rhetoric alone. The struggle over guano and nitrates exemplifies the intertwining of natural resources, national ambition, and global capitalism. The Atacama Desert, once remote and barren, became a stage where the ambitions of nations, the strategies of armies, and the calculations of international investors collided, leaving a legacy that shaped both the geopolitics and the economic landscape of the Pacific coast for decades to come. While strategies, battles, and resources defined the course of the War of the Pacific, the human dimension of the conflict and espionage daily by soldiers and civilians was equally decisive and profoundly tragic. Beyond the ironclads of the coast and the desert campaigns inland, ordinary people endured a war that reshaped lives, communities, and national identities. Their stories, preserved in letters, memoirs, and diaries, provide a window into the suffering, resilience, and courage that statistics alone cannot convey. For Chilean soldiers, the war was a test of endurance, discipline, and loyalty. Recruits marched hundreds of kilometers across scorching desert plains, carrying rifles, ammunition, and personal supplies. Many were farmers or laborers, unaccustomed to military rigor and extreme climates. Letters sent home reveal fatigue, the constant thirst, and the anxiety of facing an enemy equally determined. Yet alongside the hardship came a sense of purpose. Capturing nitrate-rich territories and securing Chilean dominance instilled pride and a commitment to the collective mission. Veterans recounted moments of camaraderie forged under fire, the shared determination to survive, and the exhilaration of small victories amid harsh conditions. Peruvian soldiers, often defending fortified positions in the desert or along the coast, faced similar trials. Many were conscripted from rural areas, thrust into a modern war in which their familiarity with terrain became both an advantage and a source of constant strain. Diaries from the Battle of Tarapaca and the defense of Arica describe the psychological toll of continuous combat, the horror of witnessing comrades fall, and the uncertainty of supply lines stretched across desolate landscapes. Yet they also demonstrate ingenuity. Soldiers learned to use the desert to their advantage, employing natural cover, conserving water, and executing flanking maneuvers against superior forces. Their courage, recorded by officers and fellow soldiers, became a source of national pride that endured long after the war ended. Bolivian soldiers, fighting alongside Peruvian allies, faced the additional challenge of being removed from their core territories. Many were ill-prepared for desert combat, lacking both adequate training and equipment. Yet their involvement was politically critical, as Bolivia sought to assert sovereignty over its coastal claims. Memoirs from Bolivian officers emphasize not only the physical hardships but also the emotional burden of fighting far from home, the fear of failing both nation and comrades, and the camaraderie that developed between troops of different nationalities. The war forged bonds that crossed political boundaries, even as it deepened national divisions. Civilians, meanwhile, bore a silent yet devastating brunt of the conflict. Cities and towns along the Pacific coast, including Arica, Iquique, and Antofagasta, experienced bombardments, occupation, and destruction. Homes were reduced to rubble, markets shuttered, and families displaced. Refugees fled inland or toward safer territories, carrying with them what little possessions they could salvage. These population movements disrupted local economies, strained resources, and created humanitarian crises that lingered long after the fighting ceased. Memoirs and newspaper accounts recount the fear of children watching artillery shells fall, the struggle to find food and water, and the resilience of communities determined to survive amidst chaos. Letters and diaries provide a deeply human perspective on these experiences. In private correspondence, soldiers often expressed longing for home, reflections on the futility of war, and empathy for their fellow combatants. Civilians recorded the dislocation, scarcity, and uncertainty wrought by occupation and military campaigns. These personal narratives reveal the intersection of endurance and vulnerability, illustrating how ordinary individuals navigated extraordinary circumstances. They also highlight the role of memory and storytelling in preserving history, giving voice to experiences that official records often overlooked. The social impact of the war extended beyond immediate destruction. Many communities saw the loss of able-bodied men to conscription, altering family structures and labor dynamics. Women, children, and the elderly were left to maintain households, tend to farms, and manage businesses in the absence of men. Some women contributed directly to the war effort, serving as nurses, suppliers, or even spies, navigating the dangerous intersections of occupation and conflict. These contributions, though often unrecognized in official accounts, were essential to the endurance of civilian populations and, indirectly, to the military campaigns themselves. The moral dimension of the war was equally significant. Soldiers grappled with ethical dilemmas, the treatment of prisoners, the destruction of property, and the impact of their actions on civilian populations weighed heavily on their consciences. Civilians, in turn, navigated the tension between survival and loyalty, making choices that could be interpreted as collaboration, resistance, or These moral complexities underscore that warfare in the Atacama and along the coast was not only a test of endurance, but also a challenge to human values, ethics, and resilience. Ultimately, the War of the Pacific transformed lives in ways both immediate and enduring. Soldiers returned home, physically and emotionally scarred, yet often celebrated as heroes. Civilians rebuilt communities and economies, drawing on both material and social resilience. Letters, diaries, and memoirs preserve the intimate details of these experiences, ensuring that the human dimension of the war, the courage, suffering, and ingenuity of ordinary people remained a central part of its historical record. These narratives remind us that beyond strategies, resources, and borders, war is lived most intensely in the daily struggles, decisions, and endurance of those caught within it. In examining the lives of soldiers and civilians, one gains a fuller understanding of the War of the Pacific. It was a conflict defined not only by desert battles, naval engagements, and territorial ambitions, but by human resilience and vulnerability. The faces of war etched in letters, diaries, and memories reveal the emotional, social, and ethical stakes of a struggle that reshaped nations and left a profound imprint on the collective consciousness of Chile, Peru, and Bolivia. The War of the Pacific was fought not only on deserts and seas, but also in the shadowed corridors of diplomacy, where alliances, rivalries, and betrayals shaped the trajectory of the conflict. The political landscape was as treacherous as the Atacama sands, and the interplay of internal and external pressures created a dynamic in which strategic miscalculations were as deadly as bullets or cannon fire. The fragile partnership between Bolivia and Peru, the subtle interventions of foreign powers, and the internal intrigues within each country collectively determined the war's course. At the heart of the alliance structure was the Peru-Bolivia Pact of 1873, a defensive treaty intended to deter Chilean expansion. In theory, it bound the two nations to mutual support in the event of aggression. In practice, however, the alliance proved fragile and inconsistent. Bolivia, politically unstable and territorially constrained, struggled to commit fully to coordinated military action. Regional divisions within Bolivia, combined with logistical limitations and the need to defend the highlands, often delayed or weakened its military contributions. Peru, on the other hand, was wary of overextending itself while balancing domestic politics and foreign pressures. The result was a partnership riddled with mistrust, miscommunication, and occasional outright non-compliance in alliance that was reactive rather than proactive, and vulnerable to exploitation by Chilean planners. Chile recognized the weaknesses in this partnership and sought to exploit them. Diplomatic initiatives, propaganda campaigns, and calculated military maneuvers were designed to isolate Bolivia and force Peru into defensive postures. Chilean commanders were acutely aware that if the two nations could not act in unison, victories in desert and coastal campaigns would be far easier to secure. Strategic foresight, combined with political calculation, enabled Chile to press its advantage while its opponents struggled with internal disunity and conflicting priorities. Foreign powers also played a subtle yet influential role. Britain, with major investments in the nitrate industry, maintained a cautious stance. While officially neutral, British diplomats monitored developments closely, balancing the protection of commercial interests with the need to avoid direct involvement. British merchants and financiers applied pressure through media and private channels, seeking assurances that nitrate supplies would remain uninterrupted. The United States similarly observed the conflict, motivated by expanding commercial influence and strategic interests in the Pacific. American representatives engaged in discreet diplomacy, offering mediation in some cases while subtly supporting commercial networks that benefited from the Chilean advance. Neighboring countries, such as Argentina and Brazil, followed events with a mixture of concern and opportunism, wary that Chilean dominance could alter the regional balance of power. These external actors complicated internal as leaders of Peru and Bolivia had to consider both domestic and international repercussions of every strategic choice. Internal politics within each country added another layer of complexity. In Peru, political rivalries between civilian leaders and military officers frequently undermined coordination. Decisions over troop deployments, fortification priorities, and allocation of scarce resources were often contested, leading to delays and confusion on the battlefield. Bolivia, facing frequent leadership changes and factional disputes, struggled to maintain coherent war planning. Corruption and bureaucratic inefficiencies further hampered military readiness. Contracts for supplies were mismanaged, funds were diverted, and essential reinforcements arrived late or incomplete. These failures were not merely administrative, they had direct consequences in the field, contributing to battlefield losses and eroding public confidence in the war effort. Sabotage and intrigue also played a role, both deliberate and incidental. Reports circulated of misappropriated supplies, abandoned fortifications, and officers defecting or undermining orders for personal or political gain. In some cases, rumors of betrayal spread faster than verification could occur, fostering paranoia and mistrust among commanders. Such internal vulnerabilities magnified the effects of external pressure and military setbacks, creating a sense of instability that Chilean strategists were keen to exploit. The combination of fragile alliances, external influence, and internal politics created a theater in which victories were contingent not only on firepower but on diplomacy, timing, and perception. A single misstep, whether a delayed reinforcement, a broken promise, or an unheeded warning, could trigger cascading consequences across multiple fronts. Chile's ability to navigate both military and political landscapes more effectively than its adversaries was a decisive factor in its eventual dominance, illustrating the interplay between governance, diplomacy, and strategy in modern warfare. Despite the eventual defeat, the Peru-Bolivia alliance demonstrated both the potential and pitfalls of coalition warfare. When coordinated effectively, joint operations offered the chance to resist Chilean advances and leverage combined resources. When coordination failed, however, even superior numbers or strategic positions could not prevent disaster. The war revealed that alliances, while essential, required not just formal treaties but consistent communication, trust, and effective leadership elements that were often in short supply. Ultimately, the politics of the War of the Pacific reveal a conflict shaped as much by human decision-making as by geography or technology. Alliances were fragile, betrayals were real or perceived, and external powers exerted influence in ways that complicated the calculus of war. Leaders faced not only the immediate demands of battle but also the complex web of relationships, rivalries, and interests that defined the political environment. Understanding this political dimension is crucial for comprehending the outcomes of the war, highlighting that success on the battlefield is inseparable from acumen in diplomacy and governance. The interplay of trust, betrayal, and ambition left an indelible mark on the history of Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, underscoring that the war was fought as much in negotiation rooms and offices as on desert sands and rocky coasts. By 1880, the War of the Pacific had reached a decisive stage. After months of attrition, both on the sea and across the unforgiving deserts of northern Chile and southern Peru, the momentum had shifted irreversibly in favor of Chile. The combination of superior naval power, effective coordination, and logistical discipline allowed Chile to dominate both land and maritime theaters, while Peru and Bolivia struggled with fractured alliances, insufficient resources, and eroding morale. The victories that would seal Chile's advantage were not sudden. They were the result of strategic foresight, sustained planning, and the hard lessons learned in previous engagements. At sea, the capture of the Peruvian ironclad Huáscar during the Battle of Angamos on October 8, 1879, marked a turning point. The death of Admiral Miguel Grau, Peru's most capable naval commander, deprived the Peruvian fleet of both leadership and morale. Chilean naval forces, having learned from earlier engagements such as the Battle of Iquique, executed a meticulously coordinated operation to trap the Huáscar and neutralize its threat. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. Chile gained uncontested maritime supremacy, which enabled it to transport troops and supplies along the coast without fear of interception. This strategic advantage was critical in facilitating the subsequent desert campaigns and coastal occupations. The loss of Peru's primary naval asset not only weakened its defensive capabilities but also undermined public confidence and exposed the limitations of its alliance with Bolivia. On land, Chile's campaign across the Atacama Desert and into southern Peru demonstrated both tactical innovation and logistical mastery. The victories at Tacna in May 1880 and Arica in June 1880 showcased Chile's ability to integrate infantry, artillery, and limited cavalry operations in a challenging desert environment. Chilean forces effectively combined frontal assaults, flanking maneuvers, and precise artillery bombardments to overwhelm Peruvian-Bolivian defenses. These engagements were characterized by careful coordination, disciplined execution, and the systematic exploitation of enemy weaknesses. By contrast, Peruvian and Bolivian troops, hampered by supply shortages, internal disagreements, and insufficient reinforcement, were increasingly unable to mount effective resistance. Tactical errors, delayed responses, and lack of coordination between allies allowed Chile to achieve a series of decisive victories that gradually eroded the territorial integrity and strategic options of its opponents. The occupation of southern Peruvian ports and towns provided Chile with both symbolic and strategic leverage. Seizing Arica, Tacna, and surrounding regions allowed Chile to control key trade routes and extract resources, further strengthening its military position. The fall of these areas also had a profound psychological effect on Peru and Bolivia. For Peru, the loss of Aricoans, a fortified stronghold and symbol of national pride, was a devastating blow to both morale and identity. Bolivian troops, already operating far from their homeland, faced the stark reality that their alliance could not prevent the progressive encroachment of Chilean forces. Letters and memoirs from the time convey a sense of disorientation and despair among soldiers and civilians alike, as the familiar landscape of northern Chile and southern Peru transformed into occupied territory. The capture of Lima in 1881 marked the culmination of Chilean strategy. By combining sea control, desert logistics, and coordinated land assaults, Chilean forces reached the Peruvian capital with overwhelming momentum. The fall of Lima was not only a military triumph but also a symbolic one, demonstrating that Chile had achieved operational and strategic dominance over its adversaries. The psychological impact was profound. For Peru, the occupation of its capital shattered the illusion of territorial security, undermined civilian morale, and intensified political instability. For Bolivia, which had already lost access to the Pacific coast, the defeat of its ally and the continued expansion of Chilean control underscored the futility of resistance without external support or a reliable coalition partner. These victories also had international implications. Chile's control of key ports and resource-rich regions enabled it to regulate, trade, and extract wealth from nitrates and guano, consolidating economic as well as military gains. The triumphs demonstrated the effectiveness of combining technological superiority, disciplined military planning, and strategic logistics, a model observed with interest by foreign powers such as Britain and the United States. which had economic stakes in the nitrate trade. Conversely, the defeats suffered by Peru and Bolivia highlighted the vulnerabilities of political fragmentation, logistical mismanagement, and over-reliance on alliances that lacked cohesion or trust. Beyond strategy and resources, the human dimension of these turning points cannot be overstated. Soldiers on both sides endured extreme hardship, but the Chilean army's superior planning, supply chains, and leadership fostered confidence and morale. While repeated setbacks undermined the spirit of Peruvian and Bolivian forces, civilians, witnessing the fall of towns and the occupation of their homes, faced displacement, economic disruption, and uncertainty about the future. Letters and memoirs from this period convey the anxiety, despair, and resilience that characterized daily life under the shadow of Chilean advancement. In many cases, psychological endurance became as crucial as tactical skill, shaping decisions on both the battlefield and occupied territories. By the conclusion of the major campaigns in 1881, the balance of power had shifted irreversibly. Chile controlled the seas, occupied critical northern regions, and had demonstrated the operational capacity to project force decisively. Peru and Bolivia, weakened militarily and psychologically, were forced into defensive postures, internal strife, and negotiations. The victories at Angamos, Tacna, Arica, and Lima exemplify the culmination of Chilean strategy, a combination of technological advantage, careful planning, and relentless execution that transformed early uncertainty into decisive dominance. In retrospect, these turning points illustrate how wars are won, not only by individual battles, but by the sustained integration of logistics, strategy, and psychological momentum. The Chilean triumph in both maritime and desert theaters reshaped the geopolitical landscape of the Pacific coast, undermining alliances, eroding morale, and securing the territorial and economic gains that would define the post-war order. For Peru and Bolivia, the defeats were a stark reminder of the costs of strategic disunity, inadequate resources, and the devastating human and political consequences of modern warfare. The conclusion of the War of the Pacific in 1884 reshaped the political and territorial landscape of the southern Pacific coast of South America, leaving an enduring legacy that would influence international relations for generations. The Treaty of Ancon, signed on October 20, 1883, formalized the cessation of hostilities between Chile and Peru and established the terms that would redraw borders, redistribute resources, and cement Chilean dominance in the region. For Bolivia, which had lost direct access to the Pacific during the conflict, the outcome represented a profound geopolitical transformation, permanently altering its strategic posture and national identity. Under the Treaty of Ancon, Chile gained control of the Peruvian provinces of Tacna and Arica for 10 years, with the understanding that a plebiscite would determine their permanent status. Tacna was eventually returned to Peru in 1929, but Arica remained under Chilean control, a tangible reminder of the war's enduring territorial consequences. Bolivia's loss of its coastal province of Antofagasta to Chile was formalized in 1904 with the Treaty of Peace and Friendship, leaving the country land. This loss had profound economic, strategic, and psychological effects. Bolivia's inability to access the sea hindered trade, restricted naval ambitions, and fueled a national grievance that persists in diplomatic discourse even today. The desert that had once been the stage for conflict had been transformed into a permanent frontier delineating power and vulnerability. Geopolitical impact extended beyond immediate territorial adjustments. Chile's acquisition of resource-rich regions, particularly nitrate and guano deposits, solidified its economic position in the global market. Control over these commodities allowed Chile to capitalize on the agricultural and industrial demands of Europe and North America, integrating the country more deeply into the global economy of the late 19th century. The shift in economic power reinforced Chilean political influence in the region and strengthened its ability to project military and diplomatic authority along the Pacific coast. For Peru, the loss of southern provinces meant the depletion of crucial economic assets and a diminished capacity to assert influence beyond its borders. Bolivia, meanwhile, faced the long-term challenge of reconciling national development with geographic isolation, prompting decades of strategic and diplomatic efforts to regain maritime access. The war also triggered broader changes in the political map of South America. By weakening Peru and Bolivia while strengthening Chile, the conflict altered the balance of power along the continent's western edge. Neighboring countries observed the transformation with caution. Argentina, Brazil, and other states recalibrated their diplomatic strategies in response to Chile's growing regional dominance. Chile's victories underscored the importance of integrated military strategy, logistical efficiency, and control over natural resources in regional power calculations. The war demonstrated that even comparatively small nations could achieve outsized influence when industrial capability, technology, and strategic planning were leveraged effectively, a lesson that reverberated throughout Latin America. The territorial and economic shifts also influenced internal politics within the affected countries. In Chile, the acquisition of new lands and resources bolstered national pride, provided revenue streams, and strengthened central authority. The integration of conquered territories required administrative adaptation, settlement, and development, further entrenching Chilean control. In Peru and Bolivia, by contrast, the loss of territory exacerbated internal divisions, fostered political instability, and encouraged debates over national priorities. Bolivian politics became increasingly preoccupied with securing alternative routes to the sea and mitigating the strategic vulnerability of a landlocked nation, while Peruvian leaders confronted the challenge of national reconstruction and the reintegration of military and civilian structures, disrupted by war. Beyond immediate territorial consequences, the war had profound symbolic and psychological implications. For Chile, victory reinforced national identity, unity, and confidence in its ability to assert authority in regional affairs. Monuments, commemorations, and public memory celebrated naval heroes, desert campaigns, and strategic brilliance, embedding the conflict in the nation's historical consciousness. In Peru and Bolivia, however, the narrative was one of loss, grievance, and resilience. Collective memory of the war shaped education, political discourse, and diplomacy for decades, fostering a sense of injustice and motivating subsequent efforts to address perceived inequities. The psychological legacy pride for Chile, loss for Peru and Bolivia became an enduring element in the triangular dynamic among these nations. The War of the Pacific also underscored the long-term consequences of resource-driven conflict. Control over nitrates and guano not only motivated Chilean expansion but also demonstrated the global stakes of regional wars. Foreign investors and governments observed the outcomes closely, recognizing that political boundaries were closely linked to economic access. The conflict became a case study in the intersection of natural resources, military strategy, and international relations, a reminder that wealth embedded in the land could provoke geopolitical transformation far beyond local borders. Ultimately, the post-war map represented a new reality: Chile as the preeminent power along the Pacific coast, Peru recovering from territorial loss and economic disruption, and Bolivia confined to the highlands with a persistent maritime grievance. These outcomes reshaped diplomatic interactions, trade patterns, and military planning for decades. The war had redrawn not only physical borders but also the strategic imagination of nations, embedding lessons about alliance cohesion, resource security, and the complex interplay of military, political, and economic power. The Treaty of Ancon and subsequent agreements marked the formal end of hostilities, but the reverberations of territorial change continued to shape South American geopolitics well into the 20th century. The new map, therefore, was more than lines on paper. It represented a recalibration of power, influence, and opportunity in South America. It reflected the consequences of strategy, resource management, and military discipline, while highlighting the enduring human, economic, and political stakes of war. For Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, the War of the Pacific and the Treaty of Ancon created legacies of control, loss, and aspiration that would define national identities, regional relations, and the strategic calculus of generations to come. The War of the Pacific, despite its profound effects on South American geopolitics, resources, and national identities, remains remarkably obscure in global historical narratives. Outside of Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, this conflict is seldom discussed in classrooms, media, or popular culture. Yet its significance resonates far beyond the arid deserts of the Atacama or the coastal fortresses of Arica and Iquitos. The war offers enduring lessons on military innovation, the strategic value of resources, and the complex interplay of politics and economics in shaping regional and global affairs. Understanding why the conflict is overlooked and why it matters requires a reflection on its military, cultural, and economic legacies, as well as its modern relevance. One reason the war is often forgotten is its geographic and demographic context. Unlike European or North American conflicts, the War of the Pacific was fought in remote deserts, high plains, and sparsely populated coastal regions. Its primary actors, Chile, Peru, and Bolivia, were not global powers, and the scale of the war, while devastating locally, did not dominate international headlines in the same way as contemporary European wars. Moreover, English-language scholarship and global media have historically focused on conflicts involving major industrialized nations, leaving regional wars like the Pacific War on the periphery of collective memory. The result is a gap in awareness. Despite the war's direct impact on global trade and resources, the military legacy of the War of the Pacific, however, is significant. Chile's use of ironclads, coordinated naval blockades, and combined arms operations set a precedent for modern military logistics and strategy. The desert campaigns showcased the adaptation of infantry, cavalry, and artillery to extreme environments, highlighting the importance of mobility, supply chains, and terrain analysis. For Peru and Bolivia, the war demonstrated the consequences of fragmented alliances, insufficient coordination, and over-reliance on outdated tactics in the face of technological and organizational superiority. These lessons influenced subsequent military planning in the region and remain relevant for modern military studies that consider asymmetric warfare, resource-driven conflicts, and coalition operations. Culturally, the war left an enduring imprint on national identity, memory, and narrative construction. In Chile, monuments, commemorations, and educational curricula celebrate naval heroes like Admiral Miguel Grau and terrestrial campaigns that secured the nation's economic and territorial gains. These symbols reinforce national cohesion and pride, framing the conflict as a story of strategic brilliance and collective endurance. In Peru and Bolivia, by contrast, the narrative is one of loss, resilience, and national grievance. The fall of Arica Tacna and Antofagasta and Bolivia's permanent landlocked status remains a potent element in political discourse and cultural memory. Literature, memoirs, and oral histories preserve the human experiences of soldiers and civilians, ensuring that even as the war fades from global awareness, its emotional and psychological legacies continue to shape identities in the Andes and along the Pacific coast. Economically, the war redefined access to strategic resources, particularly guano and nitrates, which were central to global agriculture and industry in the 19th century. Chile's victory allowed it to dominate the export of these commodities, securing wealth and integrating the nation into global markets from London to New York, Peru, and Bolivia. Conversely, experienced long-term disruption of trade, extraction infrastructure, and economic growth. The war serves as a case study in how resource control can drive conflict and reshape economies, a lesson that resonates in modern debates about natural resources, global supply chains, and economic diplomacy. Modern relevance is perhaps the most compelling aspect of the war's legacy. The Pacific War demonstrates the enduring importance of resources in geopolitical calculations. Nations today continue to navigate conflicts and alliances shaped by access to minerals, energy, and other critical commodities. The war also underscores the necessity of effective alliances, coherent strategy, and logistical planning, showing that military success depends as much on organization, diplomacy, and infrastructure as on battlefield heroics. For policymakers, historians, and military strategists, the Pacific War offers enduring insights into how regional conflicts can have disproportionate economic and geopolitical consequences, and how the mismanagement of alliances or resources can exacerbate vulnerability. Moreover, the conflict highlights the human dimension of warfare. Letters, diaries, and memoirs reveal the experiences of soldiers and civilians navigating extreme environments, scarcity, and political uncertainty. These narratives remind modern audiences that the consequences of war extend beyond territory and resources, touching the social fabric, cultural identity, and psychological well-being of affected populations. Understanding these dimensions is critical for contemporary conflict resolution, humanitarian planning, and the study of post-war reconstruction and reconciliation. In conclusion, the War of the Pacific may be classified as a minor conflict in global terms, yet its implications were it reshaped national borders, redistributed strategic resources, influenced global trade, and forged national identities. It offered lessons in military innovation, alliance management, and the economic dimensions of warfare that remain relevant today. The war illustrates how regional conflicts, even when overlooked in mainstream historical narratives, can generate outcomes with global resonance. Remembering the Pacific War and studying its causes, conduct, and consequences enriches our understanding of how human ambition, natural resources, and strategic planning converge to shape history. The conflict's obscurity in global memory does not diminish its importance. On the contrary, it underscores the necessity of examining wars beyond the dominant narratives of Europe and North America. The Pacific War reminds us that the human, political, and economic stakes of regional conflicts can ripple across continents, shaping markets, diplomacy, and national identities for generations. Its lessons about resource-driven conflict, the fragility of alliances, and the enduring cost of war remain strikingly relevant, proving that even forgotten wars can leave legacies of lasting global significance.